Howdy. Got one of my favorite sweatshirts on from Weird Al Yankovic. Drinking some cider for the season. I'm way behind on keeping up with my books. I'm not even going to talk about all the books I read, because some of them I am waiting until I finish other books. So let's get into it. I'll start with 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was a very famous journalist. Part of what made her famous, of course, was being a woman in the profession when obviously that was not common. But it wasn't just that she was doing it, it was that she wasn't stuck to the ladies' society page, and she was doing some, what I would call, stunt journalism. One of the things that she was famous for was to try to do Around the World in 80 Days, a la Jules Verne. And she did get it done in under 80 days, by the way. And that is a fun story too. Anyway, this is one of her stunt journalism pieces. I can't remember what she said the inspiration for this was, whether her employers told her to do this or she had heard about women who were institutionalized for some very iffy reasons and then how they were treated. So what she did, and she did set it up with some friends ahead of time so that she would make sure she could get out of the asylum. She had herself be put in one of the asylums in New York City at the time. And the record does seem kind of skimpy. Some of this was because she couldn't take notes while she was in the, quote, madhouse. And most of what they had them do was pretty boring. She was there for only 10 days. A lot of those women who were there for a lot longer than 10 days, obviously. Some of the women were genuinely insane or mentally ill. A lot of them were just poor or inconvenient women that relatives wanted to put aside. Many of them were immigrants who did not speak English at all. So she does talk about some of the women that she ran into. It is interesting, but unlike some of the investigative journalism we see today, there's a lot of details that you would have wanted more of. But there was court cases afterwards to try to reform the system. I don't know how well that worked afterwards, but one of the points wasn't just the mistreatment of the mentally ill. It had to do with how people were diagnosed as mentally ill to begin with. She called into question exactly how scientifically based was this. Something to think about. And how well is it done now? A Murder is Announced by Agatha Christie. Now, I actually do not log every time I read an Agatha Christie book because, let's see, sorry about that. Every time I read a Terry Pratchett or Agatha Christie book, these are kind of my comfort reading, and so I don't necessarily get it in. Most of the time it gets itself logged just because I have a Kindle version of the book I didn't have before, and it automatically records that I'm reading it. So A Murder is Announced, let's see if it says, 1950. I knew this one was post World War II because of some of the details in the book. And she uses one of her, she's used this plot device before. Her most famous books, okay, so this is something to know about Agatha Christie, and I know I've talked about this before. She uses certain plot elements as part of her mysteries often. Now, there's the romance, and that's not what I'm talking about. I mean something that's central to the mystery itself. And the ones that were her really famous books, she basically used that device only once. So the ones I'm thinking about are Murder on the Orient Express. She only did that particular kind of thing once. The ABC murders, that specific instant. There have been other ones where you have someone trying to frame somebody else for murders. but not to that extent. 10 Little Indians, and then there were none. Um, that was only done once, So the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, that was an infamous one. That was done only once. So that's kind of the thing. There were certain ones that are just kind of like, they're a good read, they're entertaining. You can make a movie or even a mini series out of them to a certain extent, but they never were famous, and this is one of them. She just kept using those plots over and over again. In some cases, they were almost identical, just a few different characters, and you could change if it was Poirot versus Marple versus none of her named characters. Some of my favorite ones that she did, I mean, and then there were none was one of them, has none of her standard characters in it, like Poirot, Marple, and Battle, Tommy Beresford, and I can't remember his wife's name. I'm sorry. So there are certain characters that do show up in a lot of her books, but some of her best books actually don't include them. Okay, Count of Monte Cristo. I always love Alexandre Dumas with regards to the Three Musketeers. If you've never read that one, highly recommend. It's a lot of fun. You learn some history. Count of Monte Cristo, you don't really learn history in this one. This is an elaborate revenge plot, and this would make an awesome TV series. Forget about miniseries. There are so many things that you could do with this, with the character, the Count of Monte Cristo, and you would start with the Count showing up and having his backstory in flashback. I actually, I actually did an abridged version audiobook because, if I remember correctly, the unabridged were like 50 some hours. And someone told me that there's all of these side adventures. That's why I say this would be a good TV series, not miniseries, because you could add plots to this character. He is so rich and so clever. And that's the thing. It's not just that he has a lot of money, and he gets that money because the man he's imprisoned with, the priest, tells him where a cache of money is to be found. And actually, he uses the death of that person to escape the prison, which is that's a great part of the book. But there's all sorts of aspects in here about him living out his revenge plot. And what's interesting, some of the pieces of revenge are a bit over the top for what they had done to him, but actually for most of them, the revenge is apt for what they did, the power they held over him, and what they made him suffer. Though, again, by the end of the book, he realizes the revenge didn't get him much. So kind of interesting. Falstaff, Give Me Life. I did this, and a lot of these are audiobooks, and I will book the audiobook, as it were. Harold Bloom, who died recently, loved Falstaff. I think he envisioned himself as Falstaff. He was a big guy. I actually saw him once at a book signing, and I believe it was like his book Shakespeare, and I know I wrote about this. Let's see. Yes, here we go. He clearly loved the character of Falstaff. He loved very specific characters by Shakespeare. Huge Shakespearean in all senses of the term. Mentor to Camille Paglia. So that's part of his legacy, Harold Bloom. But this book is going through the Shakespearean text. So he doesn't even touch upon Verdi's Falstaff. And part of this is because he hates the Merry Wives of Windsor, which the plot of Verdi's Falstaff is based on. That said, the best lines in Verdi's Falstaff come from Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. So he goes through how the character of Falstaff, basically he breathes life. He is life. So it's a short book. That's another thing. But if you're really into Shakespeare, and if you like Henry V, this gives you a different angle to Henry V of the Machiavellian prince in so many ways, always calculating, versus Falstaff, who is life that cannot be contained. And then the final one for this one is The Great Train Robbery by Michael Crichton. This is a fictionalized version of something that actually happened in the Victorian period. There is a movie starring Sean Connery. That is a fun movie, but like the really salacious items from this book, I mean, they couldn't film it when they did the movie. And you can see this cover has Connery and who was the other person? It doesn't matter. Pardon me. It is a true crime book. A lot of it's fictionalized, but I had forgotten how it really ended, and it's just fabulous. There's so many great stories in this. It's a great story, and it's still kind of a mystery. You kind of wonder what happened after the book ends, after the movie ends. Very clever. Most of the book, actually, very little about it is the robbery itself. He doesn't do much of the trial, though they do explain how the primary movers were caught, because you kind of wonder how that happened, given that, but there's a lot of kind of back or forward flashes when you're seeing how they're planning for the robbery. He talks about the testimony given later in the trial. So there are parts of it where Crichton is fleshing out that no, this really did happen by quoting the testimony from the trial. That said, you do realize most of the back has to be fictionalized in terms of conversations, details. He makes it into a real novel. So that's a lot of fun, and why not have more of these kind of fictionalized histories? It doesn't really matter the specific details, and that's something to remember. It's like the people who get het up about the Hamilton Broadway show. There's so much of it that's inaccurate in terms of, well, I mean, it's drama. It's dramatizing. Oh yeah, it's not accurate history. Duh. Just like the parts of opera that dramatize things that really did happen in history, and there's plenty of operas based on historical events. The dialogue of the Carmelites is one that the Met Opera did recently, and it has to do with some Carmelite nuns that were martyred during the French Revolution. That really did happen. But obviously, there is kind of a fictional frame around it. That's what happens. It's okay. You can enjoy your entertainment and don't have to pretend that you're really learning history. It's okay. Let's just enjoy it for what it is. So those are my first 5 books, and I'm going to do a few more.